And that's the big thing, is the consent is important. Don't take more unless you can show me how you're going to use it. If I give you my consent to go ahead and we'll make the presumption, then every year, come back and say, all right, we're going to do this again. Because at some point I may want to say no. We collectively, as the people, should have the right to say, no, this year we need the money more than you do.
So, is the rent too high? I mean, the property tax on the rent too high. But first, subscribe and like our channel. Click on that little bell icon for notifications and find the Devil's Advocate podcast on your favorite listening app. Joshua Sharf is our fiscal policy expert. How much more tax should we pay?
Nothing. Nothing. You got nothing.
You got nothing. All right, I want to go through the story of why our property taxes have gone through the ceiling, what the compromise bills have done, and if that's over and done with. Are we fixed? Are we where we want to be? Can we go back to the before time? What was it like before the Gallagher amendment, and what was Gallagher?
So this is going to sound very familiar to a lot of people. Before the Gallagher Amendment was passed, this is in 1982 when it was actually passed. Before the Gallagher Amendment was passed, Colorado had a situation where rising, the property taxes, the assessments were flat, but the assessment rates were flat. But property values were rising very quickly. And in fact, at that time, it wasn't a 2-year cycle, it was a 4-year cycle. So what was going to happen was people were going to get hit with about a 30% property tax increase based on just rising assessments. And people decided that we needed to do something about that.
Let me see if I got this right. And because property tax is really confusing stuff, but there's basically a percentage you pay on your property's value. And so if your property's worth $100,000, you're going to pay $1,000 in tax. I'm just making that up. But as it goes up, and you've done nothing, you've just lived, but now because more people are moving here, your property value is now $200,000. Now you got to pay $2,000 in property tax, but you haven't built anything, you haven't changed anything, nothing's happened. And for people who've been here a while, sometimes the property taxes are going to be more than what you paid for the house as this keeps going.
Well, the situation, like I said, in the late 70s was exactly that. And it should sound very familiar to people, where there was essentially no protection against rising assessments. And it's
just because assessments is when the county assessor comes down and says, yeah, last year your house was worth $300. I think it's worth $500 today.
Right.
That's the assessment.
That's the assessment. Now there's an assessment rate, which is set at the state level, and that's uniform for the entire state. Now you can have different types of property, commercial property, residential. Those are the two big, and we'll just stick with those. Right. Those are the two big types of property. And they can have different assessment rates. And then you have what's called the mill levy, which is how much a district charges based on the assessment rate. So I don't expect people to do math in their head, so I'll do it for them. If we have an assessment rate, let's say of 30%, which is what it was before Gallagher, your house is worth $100,000, you will be taxed on $30,000 of that, or 30%. You'll be taxed on $30,000 of that value. The mill levy, let's say, again, is $1 per $1,000 of value. So you would be charged $30 in tax on that house. That's how that calculation works.
Which is all very bizarre, because you evaluate the house, you get an appraisal, they say it's going to be worth this. Then the state says, all right, now you can tax on whatever percentage of that, and then you add by the mill levy rate. And it's like, why even do that middle part of having that assessment rate? Why not just say, your house is worth $100,000, and we charge 2% a year on whatever your house is worth?
Yeah, California essentially does that. They essentially have 100% mill levy. And one of the recommendations when this happened in the late 70s, one of the recommendations in the legislative committee was simply to go to 100% assessment rate. and then allow everything to be determined by the localities and by the school districts and so forth.
It seems like it makes more sense from a simplicity point of view.
Well, what they did instead, I mean, that certainly would be an easier way to do it, and it puts all of the power in effect at the local level, which is kind of nice. You want that to be closer to where you are. What they did instead was former Denver auditor and then at the time State Senator Dennis Gallagher came up with this idea that, well, we have so much coming out of commercial property. What's really rising fast are the residential property values, not the commercial property values. So let's do this. Let's change the assessment rates each year so that the proportion, and this is what it was at the time, the proportion of the total property tax collected statewide, 55% of it will come from commercial property and 45% of it will come from residential property. So that if residential property values are rising more quickly, we will lower the assessment rate. We'll peg the commercial and that'll be fixed. We will lower the assessment rate of residential property so that we maintain that 55 to 45% ratio. The idea was to protect homeowners from these skyrocketing property values and yet still make sure that...
The idea was a really good one in that, hey, if your property value is going up, it's not your fault it's going up, you shouldn't have to pay more, we're going to lower the assessment rate. My problem with Gallagher is that what they did for the residential side, they should have also done for the commercial side. So you had a lot of businesses who are going, wait a second, my assessment rate stays the same and you guys keep getting it lowered every year. So, we're getting hit more and more.
Well, ultimately, what happened, there were two arguments against it. That was one. The other was something that the state legislative council, which is sort of the research arm, among other things, for the state legislature, publishes each year things that are going to be on the ballot, or at least did at the time. Here's our analysis of that. And one of the points they brought up was that the property values, which will also sound familiar to people, the property values on the Front Range are what's really driving this up. Rural communities are not necessarily seeing that same increase. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to lower the assessment rate for, this is the commercial, you're going to lower the assessment rate for the residential statewide, but we're not seeing that increase. So what you're going to do is you're going to lower our total take. Now, you and I might think, oh, that's pretty cool. But the people there still want services. They still want, and so they have to vote every year on an increase just to have the same amount of money coming in to be able to provide these services.
Part of me, as I keep repeating this back, I just want to make sure I'm tracking. So in the metro area, property goes up, but that's all right because Gallagher kept the assessment rate lowering proportionally to what was going up. But out in the hinterlands, their property revenues were just coming lower and lower and lower because it was a state limit. And these guys are like, hey, we needed that money for the new fire truck. We needed that money for the roads. Now we're going to have to pass another mill levy increase. So while the state is forcing us to have the assessment rate go down, we're going to have to jack up the mill levy in order to get the same amount of money.
And that wasn't evident in the first 10 years. What happened, where that becomes more evident is when Tabor is passed. So now you want to increase property taxes, you have to go to a vote of the people. That in and of itself is also a good thing. And in fact, you saw there were years where residential property didn't rise as quickly as commercial property, let's say, statewide. And so that assessment rate, rather than dropping for a few years, might have by the formula gone up, but it couldn't go up because then you would need a statewide vote in order to adopt the higher assessment rate. So that was always being pushed down. And that
again,
and those were the two.
I'm still not seeing a problem here. It sounds pretty good to me.
Well, that's okay, but what it meant was that it exacerbated that imbalance that you were talking about. So by 2020 or so, there was a lot of pressure to simply repeal Gallagher and come up with some other mechanism for doing this. Now, I opposed the Gallagher repeal at the time. I felt that it was going to lead to exactly what happened, which was that it was repealed, and then all of a sudden the assessments, you're getting hit with these assessments as property values increase, and people are screaming in agony that they're seeing their property tax bills in some cases, in a few cases, double, but you're looking at 40% increases, which is exactly what you had in the 70s, no protection, and you had basically replicated the problem that you had back before Gallagher was passed in the first place.
A couple of things on this.
And if I might add one other thing, after Gallagher was passed, you had Tabor, okay? So many places had detabored that they didn't even have the Tabor protections of saying, well, our property taxes have gone up. The government can't keep that extra money. They have to return it to us. They had voted to detabor, which meant that the government was certainly going to keep all of that.
One place that didn't do that was Jefferson County.
Right.
And it was a very tight vote. And thanks to not detaboring, they are going to get a lot of that excess tax revenue back. Right. Whereas most other counties that did detabor, this windfall that's coming in because of their property taxes, because their assessments have gone up, the government's going to be able to keep it. It is pigs at a trough at this point. So let me say a couple things. First one is this: the way the legislature wrote this proposal was a lie.
And by the proposal, you mean
the Tabor repeal?
Okay.
I mean, excuse me, the Gallagher repeal.
The Gallagher repeal, right?
And that when I put something on the ballot, I've got to go to this committee of 3 bureaucrats called the title board, and they have to write a description of what I'm trying to get passed at the ballot boxes. When the legislature puts something on the ballot, they get to write their own title, which is they can say things like "without raising taxes," right. and it's a lie. It's a bald-faced lie. And on this, that's what they did, which made it very tempting for people to read without any increase in tax rates.
Right.
They said tax rates, but it did bring in a whole lot more tax money, so they lied. And secondly, so shame on them for doing it, and shame on us voters, because if you're going to repeal and replace something, you have to have the replacement ready.
Right. It's
kind of like when the Republicans nationwide were going to repeal Obamacare. What are you going to do? I don't know. Well, we're going to replace. No, you've got to give people, do you want what we have or this better product? You didn't have this, and it was, trust me, you just pay more in taxes, and trust me, we're going to come up with a great new system for you.
Well, and for the last 4 years, what you've seen is a series of stopgap measures where they play with the assessment rate at the state level in order to try and keep things, sort of, they've done a few kind of squirrely things like carving out special rates for green energy, for quote unquote green energy and so forth. But by and large, it's been fiddling with the assessment rates at the state level, hoping that eventually they can come to some sort of long-term agreement on what it should look like.
And by the way, even though they took little cuts to make it look like we're going to pay less, no, they've lowered the increase. It's still a massive increase.
Oh, absolutely.
We're all paying a lot more, and people who rent are paying it as well because their landlords have to pay it.
No, it's not entirely a pass-through because it's still supply and demand. And our viewers, being educated viewers, understand things like elasticity of demand. But it's largely a pass-through. That's a cost.
Housing is very inelastic.
And right now, well, it's certainly inelastic right now. I mean, you got, people, there's a housing shortage everywhere. So, that can almost all be passed through. But what we did, we wanted, so in advance of the session, and then eventually after the session as well, what we wanted to do was come up with a model policy, the ideal policy for Independence Institute. If we could write the property tax, assuming that we still have property taxes, if we could write the property tax policy for Colorado, what would that look like? And so what we did was we looked at a few other states. We looked at other states have had to deal with this problem as well. And at the same time, Colorado was dealing with this in 1979. California was dealing with it. Utah was dealing it. More recently with Texas, with so many people moving to Texas for whatever reason.
I think it's called freedom.
Well, certainly isn't for the Cowboys. They've had to deal with this as well. And so what did they do? So if you look at what California did, they basically looked at the assessment rate. And they said, you can't, we're going to have 100% assessment rate, but you are not going to have your house reassessed until you sell it. Now, initially, that also meant, if you die and your kid gets it, then it gets reassessed They pulled that out. They've made some other adjustments so that it becomes harder and harder to reassess property. But they said, if you bought your house for $400,000, then the assessment stays at $400,000 until you sell it. At which point, now we have a market price for it, and we can go ahead and we can go ahead and reassess it at that market price. Now we know what the real market value is of that house. And this was a big deal nationally. It got a lot of attention nationally.
This is Prop 13.
This is Proposition 13, and Howard Jarvis and all the rest of it. And he made the cover of Time magazine. The tax revolt, and everything. Well, it sounded really cool, and as the idea of people sort of taking back control over their own property taxes, or their own taxes at all, it was very appealing to people. The problem is that now you end up with an incredible incentive to stay in the house and to have your families stay in the house. So now you're reducing the housing stock because you have a great incentive not to sell the house. Never makes it to the market. It ends up being a subsidy for you to stay in the house. You have houses in San Francisco that have never changed hands, that are right next door to houses that have been sold. And one of them is assessed at, say, $400,000, and another one is assessed at $2 million. It makes no sense. It's a tremendous, not only is it unequal, but it's irrationally unequal.
Although I understand the attraction of it, which is, I bought this chair. This chair cost me this much. I'll pay the sales tax on this much. And then to have some bureaucrat come in and say, oh yeah, you paid that much for it, but other chairs today are a lot more, and so we're going to tax you on what it's worth. And that becomes so arbitrary, and you don't know what it's worth until you sell it. So I can see why people are attracted to that concept.
Absolutely, but what it means is that assessment rates are very blunt, end up with these kinds of sort of weird artifacts of where you bought it and when you bought it, and the same type of property or practically identical properties being taxed differently. They're a very blunt instrument, and so we really didn't. We came down on the idea of not messing with the assessment rates. If we're going to implement a new policy, here's what the commercial rate is, here's what the residential rate is. Let's just stick with those to start off with.
Right. And again, your goal in all of this, as I know we've gone through these compromises and we've got Senate Bill 233 and the special session and all the rest. Your call here was, let's pretend we could wave a magic wand.
Right.
What would be Colorado's ideal? And Prop 13, you didn't think would be it?
No, we thought that was too blunt an instrument, and that it leads to. I mean, we tried something similar with that with Gallagher. Maybe there would have been a way to refine Gallagher at the time in 2020. There would have been a way to refine Gallagher to get it to work better, but that's where you get these sort of strange anomalies that end up handcuffing localities, or end up just creating these, like I say, these anomalies in how properties are taxed. So in 1985, we also looked at what Utah did. In 1985, they passed something called Truth in Taxation. Now, it's not quite Tabor, but it's Tabor-like. It's kind of Tabor-ish. If a district is going to have property tax revenue the following year that is more than the previous year, so in 1986, you're going to have more property tax coming in than in 1985. You have to have public hearings on keeping the money. The assumption is that you don't keep the money. If you want to keep the money, if the school district or the county legislature, the city board wants to keep, the city council, whatever, wants to keep the money, they have to have public hearings on it. They have to announce it, and they have to pass a special piece of legislation to retain it. So what that means is now that's open to public pressure. If the economy is not doing as well, if there's an issue with, people are just tired of.
But this is only going to happen if property values go up, right?
Right, in general, right. Or unless people, right, if people vote a mill levy increase, then that's something else.
And do they do assessments every other year, every year?
I'm not sure how frequently Utah does that. But the point is that now suddenly the presumption is that you don't keep the money. If the local legislature wants to keep the money, they have to, they have to say so to the people at their face and say, we want to do this. They have to be hearing, and it gives an opportunity for public pressure to build against it.
Much like what Tabor did with excess revenue.
Right.
that this any of our districts, there's 5,000 districts in Colorado. If you want to keep that excess revenue, that surplus, you have to ask first, and you could ask for up to 4 years, and the government could keep that excess revenue. The Supreme Court ruled that 4 years should be read as forever. And so now
Don't tell Kamala Harris that, because if she gets elected, she's just going to stay there. She's going to say, well, 4 years forever.
And so now we don't have that at all. Was there a limit in Utah?
No, it's year to year.
Year to year.
So every year, if you want to keep that money, then you keep it for the year.
Does it ratchet up every year? So you're only asking for the marginal, or does it go to a baseline?
Oh, no. It's the marginal each year. So if a district brings in $1 million one year, next year it's going to bring in $1,010,000. Then it would have to vote on that 10,000. Next year it's going to bring in $1,020,000. It'd have to vote on that 10,000. But if you turn it back, then it would be the $1,010,000 from the previous year.
Got it.
So that's Tabor-like, and we kind of like that idea that if you're going to have, now should the limit be the same, the dollar amount from the previous year? That's another question. But the idea that at a minimum you have to go to people and say, here's what we want to do. Then we looked at what Texas did.
You got consent.
Yeah, you get some level of consent.
That's all we guys who love Tabor, all we want is consent.
Now, it's not a public vote. It's not a public vote in Utah, but it's public scrutiny, and it has to be right. What Texas did was something different. They went and this is just for local governments. School districts are a similar principle, but a little more complicated. But for local government, they said, if it's more than 3.5%, then it a difference from a more than 3.5% difference from one year to the next, then it automatically goes to the people for a vote. Otherwise, you don't keep any more than that 3.5%. That's the most you can keep year to year, is 3.5%. So if property taxes were going to be $1 million, and the next year the district was going to collect $1,007,000, then that $35,000 would be subject to a vote. The 3.5% you get to keep. The extra $35,000, the extra 3.5% you have to put to a vote. And that's automatic. They can't get out of that. So that was also appealing. What we liked about that was the automatic vote. What we didn't like so much was the fixed percentage, because it's possible for the economy to get out of whack with the measurement of the economy. So you're going to have a situation where property values have risen at the time of assessment, but you've already hit a recession.
You could have 10% inflation, and your 3% is not going to cover what the government needs to operate.
Well, alternately, you could have 10% inflation, and you're being asked to give up more,
right?
And so you want to have the chance to say no,
right?
Because you got to pay for your own food.
3.5%. Where did that come from? Or is that a magic number?
I think it was like the inflation plus a little bit. It was like ideal, inflation, the Fed's target is 2%. Let's assume that population is growing. Let's assume that there are, the individual family doesn't care about property values going up, except when they go to sell the house. But they got to pay for food. They got to pay for, so then we'll use that as a reasonable number of increase. What we came up with was what
didn't you like about so it was a fixed amount?
It was the fixed amount, right. So what we did was this: we went back to some principles that informed Tabor, and came up with something that resembles, it's sort of Tabor-like, but it takes into account the fact that you're dealing with property taxes rather than just a general tax revenue. Governments should be able to keep inflation plus just the increase in, if there's new construction, they can keep that. If there's annexation, they can keep that. But anything beyond that, they need to ask. Okay.
So in other words, kind of like Tabor allows for growth in population and inflation, here it is growth of housing and inflation.
Right. Exactly. So if people are building single-family houses, that's different from if people are building apartment buildings.
Right.
So you don't do it on a head count. You do it on the type of the property that's being built. For school districts, because that's a specific service that's being rendered, that is entirely based on population, not necessarily the population of the county, but the school population. There, we said, well, okay, inflation plus the school population. Right? So if the population of the city is going up, like say Denver, but people aren't having kids or people are sending their kids elsewhere for school, well, you don't need that extra money. Just because the population of the city has gone up doesn't mean the school district gets extra money.
If the city is Sun City and it's 99% retirees, they're not going to have more kids going to school. So you don't do it on population, you do it on school population.
Exactly.
Got it.
And so that's the limit there. I'll point out, by the way, with local governments, there had been people, I didn't find this out until I started researching the Gallagher stuff. There used to be a 7% limit. There is a 5.5% limit on local government revenues, on property tax revenues. And if you want to keep more than that, then there has to be a vote. People have to waive that, and that's separate from Tabor. That's a separate consideration.
And that was pre-Gallagher.
That was, well, I think it was 7% before Gallagher. I think it was enacted into law at 5.5% sometime after that. But that's the current limit in theory. So a lot of places have gotten rid of that limit, so you don't even hear about it anymore, and it gets conflated with Tabor. But it's a separate limitation on property taxes.
All right, let me see if I'm following.
But that's that. Okay. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But that's
basically,
a separate.
So you take a look at California, Utah, Texas. You pull the best, push away the worst, and what you're suggesting is a Texas-like limit on how much taxes can be raised on property, but instead of a fixed amount, it is a floating amount depending upon inflation and new housing.
Right.
So if there's a lot of inflation, that number goes up. If there's deflation, that number can go down.
Yeah. In fact, in theory, it could go down. Yeah. Yeah.
And does it retain the part that I think is so crucial about property taxes, and that's local control? That,
yes.
The closer government is to the taxpayer, the more responsive it is, the easier it is to keep an eye on it, the more you know the people who are running it. And that's why the state only sets assessment rates. Local governments set the mill levy rate.
Yes, and that's important.
And would you keep that?
Absolutely. These votes don't take place at a statewide level. They take place at the local level, or the school district level, or the special taxing district level. That's where these happen. These don't happen at the statewide level. So one thing that we really liked about Utah was the value of shame. Right? Shame has a lot of value. And
shame in Utah? I can't believe it.
We live in a guilt society, but there's another thing, but there's also a shame society. And so we kind of like that. And that if governments want to keep money, they should have to look you in the eye. If they can't look you in the eye, if they can't look you in the eye and explain why they want to keep this money, then they shouldn't be able to have it. So even if you vote to waive, keep the idea of a waiver vote in, that if people want to waive, that's okay. But you can't just win one vote and then it's waived forever. If you get a waiver, then you have to go back to people and say, okay, here's how much it is. We're going to have public hearings on this, and we're not going to just tuck this into some bill on dog fee licensing. You have to have a separate vote specifically to keep that money. And what that does is that forces, some governments it won't matter. It'll end up being just a routine thing that they have to do every year, and population will go along with it. But sometimes they won't go along with it. And it always forces them to go back and explain why they want to. So we like that idea of forcing the governments to, even if they've gotten a waiver, to force you to go back and say, well, here's why we want this money.
It always surprises me how much the Takings Coalition hates consent. They despise consent. Mm-hmm. And we had a revolution saying no taxation without representation. And in Colorado, we took that representation to be representation directly from the taxpayers. So not just that we elected you to look after us, but we are now looking after you by having direct elections for tax increases, debt increases, and to keep excess revenue. And then they go around and play this game of calling it a fee instead of a tax, so they don't have to ask you. And just as duplicitous and awful was taking away that 4-year detapering, that you could detaper for 4 years. And now you think of it, they can keep excess revenue in most governments as much as it grows. That's insane because times change. The largest government that hasn't been detapered is, of course, the state government, which is why they drain that excess money through fees, so there's a lot less to refund. Imagine if they didn't do that, they'd have to refund billions.
Well, and they do something else too. While we're on the subject of how they get around Tabor, when the money gets refunded, they're allowed to set up like special funds to skim that off before it gets to your pocket. And so, for instance, I believe it passed last year. It will certainly be up again this year. Para retirees will get the bill will be for a refundable tax credit, because they haven't seen cost of living increases, would be for a refundable tax credit off of their taxes, which means that they don't even pay that much in taxes. They'll still get a check, but that comes out of your pocket.
So in other words, to bail out the failing retirement fund, we're going to lose a portion of our surplus refunds.
That's right.
They are ingenious. They are so ingenious. They will find any way to squeeze taxpayers without their consent any way they can.
And that's the big thing, is the consent is important. Don't take more unless you can show me how you're going to use it. If I give you my consent to go ahead and we'll make the presumption, then every year come back and say, all right, we're going to do this again. Because at some point I may want to say no. And I should have the right to say, we collectively as the people should have the right to say, no, this year we need the money more than you do.
It's telling to me that voters have always said no to detapering at the state level. But when it comes to a local level, where the school district or the city says, we need a new library, we need a new firehouse, here's where it's going to be, here's what it's going to look like, you can see it, touch it, and people go, okay, I know what I'm getting. And they've been much more generous on the local level. It tells me that taxes are a local issue, and communities should decide what's best for their community.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I like about what we mentioned, the bill that came out of the legislature. So when we were talking about the 5.5% limit on local governments, for the first time, this would impose a limit on school districts. It would impose a 6% limit from year to year on school districts, unless there were a vote allowing them, again, to keep the overage. Now, it's an interesting question as to why 6% for schools and 5% for local government. But maybe the Colorado Education Association will have something to say about that. But in any event, they're imposing this limit. But in order for it to be waived, it has to be a statewide vote to waive it. So you can't just waive it locally. And what I like about the fact that it has to be a statewide vote is that Colorado has, in general, been very reluctant to waive this sort of thing statewide. So it's harder to get 50% of the population statewide to make that decision.
That sword cuts both ways, in that as the Boulder-Denver area gets more and more loony, it can have its will statewide. The wolf reintroduction is a perfect example of urbanites destroying the lives of rural people. And so you could have, if there's enough population, raising those rates for everyone.
Well, that's a good point. You could get over the hump, and then, for instance, say Prowers County, which doesn't want to see this waived, it ends up being waived for them as well. On the other hand, they could always go back and de-taper.
Because
they have the option of revoking.
Governments are so good at that. They always turn away free money, I tell you.
Well, no. I mean, this would have to be a vote of the people as well.
Right.
But they could do it.
It's only Douglas County that I've ever seen say, we're taking in too much money. We're going to refund more just because our assessments go up. I've never seen any other county do that. And that's why we need these reforms. All right, so you've got this great plan. Sounds good to me. And you're going to make it a reality, what, this year?
Well, listen, it's always a good idea to know where true north is. Now, the famous scene out of Lincoln, the movie, and he's explaining to I forget who it is he's talking to, but he's explaining, what's the value of knowing true north if the compass can't tell you what's in the way, the swamps and the walls and the forests and everything else. You're gonna end up hopelessly bogged down. So maybe you have to deviate a little bit to get there. But the point is, if you know where you're going, we have a reform now that still doesn't really protect people from large assessment increases.
Yep.
All right. People are still going to be seeing it sets it, I think, at what, 7.15%.
I think it's now 6.9 or something.
Is it 6.9? Okay. Yeah. For what, 6 years for some period of time. That's what it's set for. Those are still going to rise, and they could rise very quickly. We could see this come back. You could see this issue come back at some point. And you want to be ready with, well, here's an overall approach that we would like to have. Even if you don't do that, even if you tinker with it a little bit here and tinker with a little bit of it there, you know what direction you want to be able to push things in.
Well, they know what direction they want to put it in, and they always win. Repealing Gallagher got governments a lot more money. The so-called replacements were nice, but it didn't reduce taxes. Right. It barely reduced the rate of increases.
But Prop HH lost.
But Prop HH lost.
So it is possible. It is possible to win occasionally.
That was a defensive.
That
was a defensive play.
Right.
It's tougher to get the offensive plays to go.
Well, yes, that was a defensive play. You're right. That's harder to do.
I'm always right.
But but it's easier to do when people are facing a real crisis in their personal finances, and then the tax collector comes around and says, by the way, your property taxes are going up 20% this year.
There's a lagging factor there, though. My property taxes went up my values went up a couple years ago. Now they've stalled, if not gone down, but I got to pay the property taxes on what it was worth 2 years ago when it was at the highest in Colorado history.
Yeah, people hate that. And so that's the opportunity that you have to maybe get something pushed through that begins to push things in a direction of greater local control, greater public control, and restrictions on how much the government gets to keep.
Some accountability. That's all we're looking for. Transparency and accountability. People want to read this paper. Where do they go?
So they go to i2i.org, and we have it up there.
It's thinkfreedom.org as well. We'll get you there. The name of the paper?
It's our model property tax policy.
Terrific. Hey, Joshua, thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed that conversation, by all means, click one of these other great programs. We have the best conversations with the most fascinating Coloradans. And subscribe to our channel. Just click down below and hit that little bell button too. You don't want to miss a single show.